This is Austin Liddy Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. Andrew Porter was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His short stories have appeared in numerous publications, and one collection of his work won the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. He's also written 2 acclaimed novels. Andrew is a professor of English and the director of creative writing at Trinity University in San Antonio. He talks with our Scott Semigran about his latest collection of stories, The Disappeared.
Welcome to the show, Andrew Porter.
Thank you so much for having me. As you know, I'm a huge fan of this podcast, and it's really an honor and a delight to be on it.
Excellent. So a lot of your books have been translated into multiple languages. Do you speak any of those languages, like French or Spanish or Dutch?
Spanish a little bit. I lived in Ecuador for a summer when I was younger, and during that, by the time that summer was over, I was barely fluent, but that was a long time ago. So it comes back to me in certain situations, but it's unfortunately not what it once was.
Sure. We'll have to come back to that. But I want to get started by showing everyone your latest book, which is The Disappeared. I loved this book so much. And I'm not ashamed to say it, it became somewhat of an Andrew Porter superfan. I then, after reading The Disappeared, I dove into The Theory of Light and Matter, which was also fantastic. And then went to the Twig in San Antonio and bought this copy of In Between Days, which was autographed by you. And speaking of San Antonio, a lot of the stories, or most, in The Disappeared, they take place in Central Texas, whether in San Antonio or in Austin or surrounding areas. And so can you talk about the importance of these 2 cities in particular, as far as being setting for this collection?
Sure. You know, it's interesting. I lived in San Antonio for about 10 years or so before I was able to write any fiction that was set here. You know, my family's out in California, and I grew up on the East Coast, so I tended to identify more with those places, although I had set my novel in Houston. But for whatever reason, I just was not able to set stuff in San Antonio. And then something happened when I started writing the stories for this book. And I think it had to do partly with the fact that just prior to writing those stories, my children were born. And I think my sense of where my home was really shifted to the San Antonio and kind of Austin area. And suddenly I just found that I was setting a lot of these stories there. And I became conscious of it at a certain point after I'd written a certain number. And I figured, I didn't know why this was happening, but I figured, you know, there must be some subconscious reason for why. And so I just kind of kept going with it. I decided not to disrupt that. And yeah, and then, you know, once I became really aware of it, that the book was definitely going to have a regional connection, then I just started like purposely trying to put things into the stories that I really love about this part of the country, you know, as a way of kind of celebrating things, you know, foods or certain types of trees or plants or other things that I associate. And to give the book, I guess, a kind of atmosphere that fits my own sense of what this part of the country is like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. And I remember feeling kind of like a sense of joy after reading the first few stories where it's like, oh, this takes place in the King William area of San Antonio. I'm familiar with that area. Or this story takes place in Westlake in Austin, and feeling like I could immediately put myself in those places because I'm familiar with those places. But not only am I familiar with those places, but you did such a good job of really shining a light there you could tell you were very familiar and you had a lot of love for those areas, and that really kind of shone through in the stories. They became an important element of the stories rather than just background.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there are particular parts of San Antonio that I focus on that people who are not from here might not necessarily get. But yeah, I wanted the stories to be set in particular neighborhoods. A lot of them are set in like right the King William or Southtown areas, which is where a lot of artists live, and it has a particular sort of feel to it that I wanted to evoke in certain stories. And so, yeah, it's like, it's interesting because this, people who are reading this book who've never been to Texas, for example, are like, this is not my sense of what Texas is like.
Right.
Uh, but, for me, it's like, this is my version of Texas that kind of connects to the world that I live in here, which is, a world of artists and academics and,
Mhm. I think that's something that kind of surprises a lot of people when you talk about San Antonio, not Austin per se, because Austin's known as a music town, but when you tell people that there are art communities in San Antonio, at least from my experience, they get pretty surprised. But San Antonio in a lot of ways is similar to Baltimore, Detroit, or Fort Worth, where there are thriving communities. People just don't know that because they're underground, basically.
Yeah, that is definitely true. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, Austin kind of overshadows San Antonio when it comes to the art scene, the music scene, the film scene, all of these, and for that reason, I think people aren't always aware that there's stuff going on here, but there certainly is. There, a lot of wonderful writers here, a lot of incredible artists. And there's music, also um, that's coming out of here, and as you know from growing up here, that's traditionally, come out of here. So
Right. I wish we could discuss all the stories in the book because I love them all, but I'm just going to focus on a couple. So one of the stories, titled Pozole, the narrator of that particular story talks about this little hole-in-the-wall restaurant that has this astoundingly good pozole soup. And then one day, just overnight, the restaurant closes, another family comes in, they open a completely different place, and then the soup is just gone. And so the narrator is basically in a state of grief over this particular change. Can you talk about what fascinated you about this kind of mini travesty that could happen? That there could be this gem of a place somewhere and then it can just vanish and disappear.
yeah, so this book, like all the stories are about different types of disappearances, but not all of them are huge, catastrophic disappearances. Some are these really kind of small ones, right? The types of small disappearances that occur in our lives, that nevertheless kind of affect us. And, I think that everyone can kind of relate to that feeling of like once living in a place and then coming back there after a certain number of years and discovering like your favorite restaurant is gone or your favorite bar or coffee shop. And there's a particular type of sadness, not just that you can never go there again, but also it's almost like all of your memories connected to that place also sort of disappear or feel like they've vanished. And so I wanted to capture that feeling a little bit. But also for the narrator in this story, it's kind of a place of escape for him. And it's his own kind of secret place that nobody else knows about, where he goes for
Mm,
lunch every day and has this pozole soup. And, I think when you're a new parent, like, you know, after a certain point, it feels like you don't have anything that's like purely your own anymore, right? That kind of vanishes. And that's what's happened for this narrator. And this is the one thing that he has that's like his own, right? This secret lunch place where he gets his really incredible pozole soup. And so when that disappears too, and the community associated with it kind of disappears, um, he's left without that one thing in his life that's kind of like his own thing. And so that's part of that story too. And
Hmm.
these are kind of like small moments of sadness or loss in one's life, but nevertheless, they can be really feel really devastating.
Right. Austin's kind of going through this cultural kind of, I don't know what you would call it, where people they're sad that institutional businesses are closing, whether it's restaurants or music venues or those type of things. And those are literally the things that make, when people say keep Austin weird or they think of Austin, those are the things that made Austin that thing. And now that they're disappearing, there's like a sense of sadness for a lot of people. They're reminiscing about places they used to go see bands, or they'd get a great enchiladas and they're not around anymore. And so um, I really related to that with this particular story.
Yeah, that is, I mean, something that I've seen in Austin too, just over the years. I think everybody has, and yeah, there
Right.
is
So
that
speaking of
sadness.
Austin, there is a story in your collection called Austin. And that particular story stands out for me because it's in kind of two dramatic parts. One is the narrator goes to a party where there's a bunch of old college buddies, and they're telling stories and getting drunk together. And one of them tells a story about an acquaintance who killed an intruder, and they ask the narrator his opinion. And rather than give his opinion, he just kind of mysteriously disappears from the party. But then the second part of the story is that he's actually dealing with the possibility that there's an intruder coming into his house or someone going into a building in the back. Can you talk a little bit about why you think he just left the party initially and you just kind of made a dramatic turn there? But then also, there's a real sense of dread in that second part of the story that's really palpable. So first, can you talk about maybe why he left the story and why you made a turn that way? And then what do you do to actually help readers feel that sense of dread that the narrator's feeling?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that story is about, I think, is this narrator coming to terms with the fact that he's no longer the person he was in his 20s, right? And so he comes to this party and he sees all these people he knew years ago, and they're childless. They look kind of the same. They've not really changed, right? Whereas he's gotten married, he has two children, and he feels very different from them in a lot of ways. And they're kind of having one of their conversations they might have had, years ago. And rather than kind of participate in it, he finds himself just kind of taking a break from the group, fixing himself a drink in the kitchen. And then rather than going back and rejoining the conversation, he just feels compelled to leave. And, I think that it's like the first step in the journey of this story, which is a journey toward kind of coming to terms with the fact that you're not who you once were. And so he doesn't leave in a, he's not trying to be rude, and it's not mean spirited. Um, he realizes that he doesn't want to have these types of conversations anymore, and that these people are not part of his world anymore. And he returns to the world that is his world, which is his wife and his children who are asleep when he gets home. Um, and yeah, and you know, one of the things that I thought would be interesting is if, like what was kind of bothering him about this story, which was that it was kind of, upsetting to him to think of an intruder entering someone's house. Like, what if there was the possibility that that might be happening when he goes home? And it doesn't happen, but
Right.
there's the fear that this has happened.
Yeah.
Kind of that captures this feeling that you have when you're a new parent, that suddenly nothing in the world feels safe anymore, right?
Right.
And you feel like this intense um, desire to protect everything, particularly your family, but that there's this sense of like, I want to protect my life. And so that kind of comes into the story toward the end. But I wanted to kind of bring back that feeling. I thought that would be um, kind of interesting. And so, yeah.
So when you're working on the page with it though, and you're thinking about that, like the fear, what are some of the things that you're doing in the mechanics of your writing and you're focused on, they're like, how can I translate that fear that I'm feeling internally to the page that then the reader can sense that? Or are there things, were you conscious of that? Of like, I'm trying to transfer this sense of dread to the reader?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, I mean, a lot of these stories are about anxieties that parents feel, right? And so that's a lot of the dread, not in all of the stories, but in a number of them that involve like parents and young children. That dread is just, coming from some of those familiar anxieties. And those anxieties I was very close to myself at the
Mm-hmm.
time I was writing the stories, and they were new feelings that I'd not had before in my life, right? Like this fear of something happening to your child, or this need to kind of protect your household. Um, and I think that probably I was just drawing on that, and kind of those feelings were coming into the stories naturally because I was experiencing a lot of those feelings at that time, and they were new emotions to me. So I don't know how conscious it was. I think those naturally just kind of came into the stories because that was going on in my own life.
Interesting. So with both of your collections, it seems that you really have a command of the short story form. Who are some other writers that are masters of short story that you admire, and what did you learn from them about writing short stories?
Yeah, there's so many short story writers that I admire. It's hard to kind of narrow it down, but when I think about writers who had a particular influence on me, one of the big writers is Stuart Dybek, and particularly his first collection, The Coast of Chicago. And I just love the tone of those stories. They're very quiet, a little nostalgic or wistful. Um, they're very elegantly written, and there's just something in the aesthetic, the feel of them that I love. And maybe because Diebeck started out as a poet, and he'd written like a couple books of poetry, I think, before he started writing short fiction. And this was his first transition, I think, into writing fiction. And so these stories kind of defy sort of traditional narrative structures. They're really organic, and they feel like poems in a way. And so he was a writer I probably first discovered in my 20s, but who I kept coming back to, unlike some of the writers in my 20s that were influential that I didn't keep coming back to as I got older. But Dybeck is someone I continue to read. That book is one I continue to go back to. So he looms large for me. More recently, this writer, Sarah Majka, um, you know, I don't know, in the past, 6 or 7 years, she's probably been the most significant short story writer. And the appeal is the appeal of her work is very similar to the appeal of Dybeck's work for me, which is that she writes these really elegant stories that feel sort of poetic, that have a kind of wistful tone to them, um, and that defy kind of traditional narrative structures. And so I don't know if I can pinpoint like what I have learned from these writers so much as that there's something in the the aesthetic quality of their stories, and the emotional quality of their stories that I really aspire to. And so, um, I think they're both masters, in particular ways, but they represent kind of, for me, like what I'm interested in.
Hmm. It's interesting when I think back to my 20s and a lot of the writers that I like then compared to what I like now, and it's so different. Although there are a few that still have significance to me. And I remember the first time reading short stories by Charles Bukowski, because he's more known as a poet, or he has a few novels that he's well known for, but no one really talks about his short stories. But to me, it seemed like that was the perfect form for him because his short stories didn't have any structure to them. They were more about style and his voice. and he was so funny to me, his narrative voice.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting when poets kind of go into fiction because there is something different about how they approach it compared to someone who writes a structured story or novel.
Yeah. Dennis Johnson's another
Hmm.
who
Right.
started out as a poet, and I see similar qualities in his short fiction. And like Jesus' Son, those stories don't fit typical story structures. Like they're
Hmm.
it's doing their own thing. So yeah, I think there's something I tend to I think like writers who start out as poets. And I'm trying to think about like Jane Ann Phillips, I think was a poet first, but there a lot of fiction writers start with that, and I
Hmm.
think that kind of informs their sense of structure and form, and yeah.
So do you have any rituals that you like to do before you write that help you kind of get in the right frame of mind? Do you go to the same place? Do you have the same type of beverage? Is there anything that you like doing before you start each session?
Yeah. One thing that I've learned over the years is just how important environment is to me. I wish I had been more aware of that when I was younger, just how sensitive I am to like sound and the feel of a space. And so, I have discovered that there are particular spaces where I tend to work well. I realize it needs to be quiet. Um, it's nice if it's not too like cramped or claustrophobic. If there are windows that I can look out to nature. Those are all things that I've discovered over the years are really important to me. So I do like think about the environment in which I'm going to write. And luckily I have a good space in my house where it has all of those elements to it. But then beyond that, I think I drink coffee. Sorry, my dog is, you maybe saw in the back. I drink, coffee like many writers to just kind of to wake up and kind of get focused. And then I'll usually read for about 10 minutes is a big part of my ritual. Um, I will sometimes just to kind of calm myself down. I don't know if you call it meditation, but just kind of close my eyes and concentrate on my breathing, just to kind of relax and get into that state of mind. Sometimes listen to music. But I have a hard time transitioning from like writing emails or dealing with, bills or something like that to just writing fiction. I need a period of transition. And so I do have certain rituals that have always been part of my process. Yeah.
If I can, I like to take a walk before I start writing. If I can take a 20-minute walk, that usually helps me kind of flush all that what you're talking about, kind of the mundane stuff, paying the bills, the emails, and all that. In fact, yesterday I went on a walk and I had kind of a stressful morning with other things. And by the time I got back, all of that stuff was out of my head. I was only gone for maybe 20 minutes. But...
Yeah. No, walks are wonderful as well. Yeah, I agree. They can be great.
So, can you talk a little bit about your journey as a writer? Like, when did you first discover you had an interest in writing, and what were you doing at the time to?
Yeah, I was, I entered college wanting to be, like a film major, thinking I was gonna focus on filmmaking. And then kind of got sidetracked when I took a fiction writing class. And in that class, I was introduced to short stories for the first time, like contemporary short stories.
Hmm.
And I just fell in love with the form and with what a lot of these contemporary writers were doing. I'd never seen anything like that. My idea of short stories were like Nathaniel Hawthorne's, stories. Like I just had never seen
Right.
anything like Laurie Moore, Amy Hempel, or people like this. And it blew my mind. And I really, it didn't take long before I wanted to try to do that myself. And so probably about halfway through college, I became more serious about it. And then by the time I graduated, I didn't know if I was going to fully commit my life to it, but I thought I wanted to go to graduate school to kind of to further develop it. And so I went to grad school pretty young. I think I was about 23 when I entered, and 25 when I graduated. And so by the time I graduated, I definitely knew that this was who I was. It wasn't something happened in those 2 years that kind of solidified my commitment to this life. Which is not to say I didn't still have occasional thoughts of going to law school and many other more practical paths.
Right.
Um, and then it just became, through my 20s, late 20s, a lot of moving around the country. I lived in California, Northern and Southern California for a while, lived in Baltimore. And I was just kind of I was teaching part-time at various schools and just trying to give myself time to write. Um, and then when I got the job at Trinity here in San Antonio, at Trinity University, and I had I don't know, I guess that stability that came with the job, I was really able to finish up my first book, The Theory of Light and Matter. And, I feel like once that happened, there was no going back. Like once I had a book, I was not, and I had, I think my identity as a writer was pretty set in stone at that point. And then since then, I wrote another novel. I had a long period between that and this latest book that disappeared and my new novel that's coming out. So that was a kind of period of having young children. And I don't think I have to explain
Right.
um, you know, what that means. So, but yeah.
So what's the last book you read that maybe defied your expectations a little bit? Maybe you were kind of reluctant to read it and then you read it and it knocked your socks off. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I would say maybe like the hero of this book, Elizabeth McCracken's
Okay.
latest, which, you can call a novel or a memoir. I think she
Mm-hmm.
calls it a novel, so I call it a novel, but it has strong non-fictional elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't surprised that I loved it because I love all of her work. So that wasn't the surprise, but I was just surprised by what she was doing with this blurring of fiction and nonfiction. And I'd seen that done before, but never quite like this book. And it was so original and so moving. It was just such a moving book. The ending of that book just devastated me. And yeah, I don't think I knew what to expect, but I was just surprised by what the experience of reading that book was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I read, I don't know if you're familiar with S.A. Cosby, but he writes like crime thrillers. And I'd been wanting to read one of his books. I don't really read that type of stuff very often. But I read his book, Razorblade Tears, and I was really surprised by the emotional depth of that book. It really was surprising. I found myself, in tears in certain chapters with this revenge, kind of hard-boiled revenge story. But he was able to tap into these two fathers' grief in such a way that it really got to me. And I was really surprised by that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes books, particularly by a certain author, I mean, Elizabeth McCracken, I associate, like, I know I'm going to laugh. I know it's going to be really funny. It's going to be really,
Hmm.
it's going to be really interesting on the level of language, just
Right.
pleasurable on the level of language. But I don't think I was quite prepared for like you're saying with the essay Cosby, like the emotional, sometimes books that you're not expecting to have that effect on you, like sneak up on you.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess I just didn't expect that from a genre thriller type book, but it was very surprising. Okay, well, now's the time of the show where we do the lightning round. It's not our concept. We got it from inside the actor's studio, but it's not their concept. They took it from Bernard Pivot and he took it from Marcel Proust. So, Andrew Porter, are you ready for the lightning round?
I am
Excellent. What is your favorite word?
luminous,
What is your least favorite word?
fecund,
What turned you on?
incredibly accomplished people who are also extremely modest and even shy.
Well, that's nice. What turned you off?
Narcissist.
Same. What is your idea of happiness?
A dinner party in which everyone I love is in attendance.
Ooh, that sounds nice. Who's your favorite author?
Stuart Dybek.
Excellent. If you could be any character from a well-known novel throughout history, who would that be?
Binks Balling from The Moviegoer.
Excellent. What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
Being a filmmaker.
What profession would you least want to do?
Anything that involves schmoozing, like being a president or a politician or,
Yeah, it sounds like death. All right. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
you made it.
Excellent. Andrew Porter's new latest book, The Disappeared. Excellent book. Everybody will go out and get it. And thanks for being on our show.
Thank you. It's been a delight, Scott.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liddy Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.